Hello, this is Arius Rodriguez, and this is the Kingdom of God and Christ. Today we're going to be looking at a couple of things. We've been kind of getting on this little kick. I've got a little paper that I assembled of just tidbits of information here and there, and some of them are random and some of them aren't. So please forgive me if they don't make some sense. But what I want to do is, in this video, is show how because Arius lived in 300, and you have what I believe is Arianism, which I feel like I'm proving very well, that Arianism existed in the early church prior to Nicaea and 60 years after Nicaea, after they kicked all of the Trinitarians out. You have the scholars defining the belief systems that are not Trinitarian, other things. And it's eerily similar to the doctrine of Arianism, but they don't use the word Arianism because chronologically, yes, Arius didn't exist until after 300. But if it's identical, if the doctrine is identical to Arianism, then we have to acknowledge that they're identical, at least. And so this is what I want to do. I want to show you that the way that they've hidden this truth, that Arianism, what is called Arianism, that if you go to the definition of what Arianism is, and you see that Arianism believes that Jesus and the Father are not one and the same substance, but they're the similar substances, or they have the same kind of substances, but they're not literally joined like Siamese twins into the same essence of themselves, that they're separate, and that there was a moment in time when the Son did not exist, that he is a little different from the Father in that sense, not having always existed. You understand the definition. So if you take what identifiers you can and break down Arianism into its simplest forms and take off the name Arianism and try to match it with things that exist prior to Arius, then you start to understand that there are things that are being called other names that are exactly identical or almost near exact identical to Arianism. And so this is what I'm saying. They don't call it Arianism in the scholarly world because it's pre his name, his birth. But it's not, because my point is that because it's actually the original doctrine of the church, that it has existed from the beginning, and when it got to Arius, he found people who opposed him in the church, and then they just called what he believed Arianism because they could, but that he even said that he was taught it. And we can go into some other deep things, like where the bishop Alexander, who started the Council of Nicaea, who was on the Trinitarian side, he used to teach what is called Arianism. He taught Arius and Eusebius things, the same things that Arianism says. But he changed his view. He's the one who changed his view. And Arius is the one who said, "Foul, you don't change your view. You're the one changing the original doctrine." And that's where this problem started. When Arius called out the bishop and said, "You're changing your doctrine, you're changing the scriptures, you're wrong." And that's where the fight started. Bishop Alexander was like, "I'm not going to have anybody tell me I'm wrong." And he did whatever he could to stop him, to push him down. But if somebody teaches wrong, whoever they are, they're wrong. And so this is the original doctrine. So it has to exist. If it's not something new from Arius, it has to exist prior to Arius. And so here's my evidences for that. Subordinationism, Edmund Fortman, pre-creational generation. He says they, talking about the first theologians, the church's first theologians, he says they identified Christ with God, with the Logos, with the Son of God. But they seem to count his sonship not from eternity. That is exactly Arianism, folks. That is exactly Arianism. Then it says, but from the moment of his pre-creational generation. That means birth before the creation. That's Arianism as well. And then in thus, using a two-stage theory of a pre-existent logos to explain the Son's divine status and his relationship to the Father. That is Arianism. He's calling it subordinationism. This is pre-Arius here. Pre-Arius, the first theologians. This is pre-Arius here. Let's move on. The Westminster Book of Patristic Theology. Patristics is the Church Fathers. Under subordinationism, not under Arianism. Although let's not see how you eventually get to the Council of Nicaea here in this other one here. The term is commonly is a common retrospective concept used to denote theologians of the early church, early church, who affirmed the divinity of the Son. Arians affirm the divinity of the Son. Then you look at this other half, conceived it somehow as a lesser form of deity than that of the Father. That's Arianism. Okay? We believe, we affirm the divinity of the Son, but that he's a lesser form divinity than the Father. That's Arianism. What's it being called? Subordinationism. Okay? The New Catholic Encyclopedia says, the subordinationist tendencies can be found in Hermes, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen. The classic forms of subordinationism are the following. The first entry, although it does start with an A, is Arianism. Amazing that subordinationists and Arianism is a classic form of subordinationism. Are you understanding what I'm trying to tell you? When you see in the early church scholars saying this is subordinationism, or that these people are being subordinationists, or this and that, that's kind of the AKA, also known as Arianism term. So when you see subordinationism in the early church prior to Nicaea, most likely 99% of the subordinationism that they're describing is Arianism. It's just not being called Arianism, but don't be fooled. It is exactly Arianism. And the point is that subordinationism is Arianism in the early church prior to Nicaea. And it's just something that's not being admitted to. And so you say, oh, I don't see Arianism back then in the early church fathers. Well, when you see subordinationism, and when they're talking about these early church fathers being subordinationists or having subordinationist tendencies or teaching or preaching subordinationism, you can change that and just say it's Arianism, because it's exactly the same. Okay? This is the Catholic Encyclopedia. Okay? That's what it says. Henry Bettison. Pre-Nicene was subordinationism. Henry Bettison, the early church fathers, his book, he says, quote, subordinationism is the true pre-Nicene orthodoxy. What did I say about subordinationism? Subordinationism is Arianism. Remember, we looked at the definition of subordinationism up here. And how this subordinationism that they identified Christ and all of that pre-creational generation, that's Arianism. A lesser form of deity than the Father. That subordinationism, the term, just the essence of the subordinationism is Arianism. So then when you come down here and look at Bettison's quote, he says subordinationism, which should be synonymous with Arianism, is the true Nicene orthodoxy. Then we have R.P.C. Hansen. he says, in the search for the Christian doctrine of God, he says, quote, with the exception of Athanasius, who is the champion of Trinitarianism, with the exception of Athanasius, virtually every theologian, East and West, accepted some form of subordinationism at least up to the year 355. That's past the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was 325. So they had some form of subordinationism, or also known as Arianism, up to the year 355. Okay? Get that through your head. What's subordinationism? What was the definition up there? Where they believed that the Son was a lesser deity that had a divine form but was less than the Father. That there was a, what did it say? First of all, classic forms of subordinationism is Arianism. So Arianism here is subordinationism. Subordinationism is Arianism. But conceived it somehow as a lesser form of deity, of divinity. What did it say here? A pre-creational generation. That's a time when he did not exist and then he was created pre-creationally. This Arianism. Subordinationism is the true pre-Nicene doctrine, orthodoxy. Amazing. With the exception of Athanasius, virtually every theologian, East and West, accepted some form of Arianism, at least up to 355. Okay? So, I'm just going to leave it right there. But I'm trying to show you that these gentlemen, who are Trinitarians, are showing you things that they've seen. They're being very honest. And when we put the pieces together, you're starting to see that subordinationism is Arianism. Binitarianism is Arianism, when there's no such thing as homoousios in the early church doctrine. It's amazing, but you'll see that subordinationism in the early church pre-Nicene is Arianism. When it's called Binitarianism, it is Arianism, because the existence of homoousios does not exist until Nicaea. So everything pre-Nicene called Binitarianism is a lie, because that concept is not added. The consubstantial concept does not exist in the church at that point, and because of that, it's not Binitarianism, it's Arianism. Look it up. You're confused. This is truth here. We're looking at historical facts and what people have studied and found. So